A while ago, London Aquarium made a decision to not announce the gender of a newborn penguin chick in an effort to encourage discourse around the subject of gender roles and identity. This obviously upset a lot of conservatives, and the following argument against this decision was particularly jarring.
Where does radical leftist gender ideology lead? Do liberals want human children to be genderless? If so, why? Is this based on biology? And if not, then what? What happens when human children are raised genderless? If gender is destroyed, doesn't that destroy traditional gender roles? And if gender roles are destroyed, doesn't that destroy gendered relationships? And if gendered relationships are destroyed, doesn't that destroy traditional marriage? And if traditional marriage is destroyed, doesn't that destroy the family unit? And if people aren't dependent on their families, then who do they depend on? That's right, the government, which is the goal of liberals in the first place. Don't let transgender penguins fool you. And that's my final point.
Yes, Liz Wheeler from OAN really did just argue that agender penguins are a liberal plot to make Americans depend on the government. No matter what your views on gender are or what your opinions on these genderless penguins may be, any person with an IQ above 2 can tell you that this was objectively not a very good argument. There's something obviously very wrong with the construction of the argumentation. But what is it about this argument structure that is so offensive to our intellectual sensibilities? It's because this argument commits a logical fallacy. A logical fallacy is a common error in reasoning that undermines the logic of an argument. In other words, it's a faulty justification. The specific fallacy that Liz Wheeler is guilty of in this clip is the slippery slope fallacy. A slippery slope fallacy is a pattern of reasoning that takes some small, seemingly insignificant event and claims that it will culminate in a much more extreme and usually negative event. In its most basic form, it consists of 3 features: a mild start, an extreme end, and a series of small steps to connect these 2 events. The Liz Wheeler clip is a perfect example of this logical fallacy. The mild start of the argument in this case is the decision of the zoo to not announce the gender of its recently born penguins. The extreme end is that all Americans will have to depend on the government because they won't have families anymore. This reasoning is achieved through a series of small steps. Genderless penguins means that there will be genderless babies. Gender will be destroyed, therefore, so there will be no gender roles. If there's no gender roles, there's no gendered relationships. Then there's no traditional marriage. Then there's no family unit. And then people have to depend on the government instead because they cannot depend on their family unit. Arguments that rely on this kind of reasoning can be evaluated by the strength of the claimed links between events. If these links are weak, then the argument is committing a slippery slope fallacy. The link between most of Liz Wheeler's events are, in fact, weak and tenuous. For example, there's no strong argument that traditional marriage creates a family unit. How is she defining traditional in the first place? Arranged marriages, which are commonplace in South Asian cultures, are not traditional in an American sense, yet they also create family units which are just as strong as any other. It's also a tenuous step to say that if you're not depending on family, you're depending on government. In fact, this step in itself is a logical fallacy known as the black and white fallacy, in which 2 alternative states are presented as the only possibilities, even though there are actually many others. This fallacy will be covered later in a different video. The point is, all of these steps here have many faults, and Liz Wheeler is therefore guilty of the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy is quite a common fallacy, and it's also one of the easier fallacies to spot. It's often used in conversation when someone is trying to persuade another person to complete a certain action, or conversely to dissuade them from completing an action. A stereotypical example would be when a parent tells their child that if they don't complete their homework, they won't get a good job in the future. We've all heard the steps that come in the middle. This is a fairly harmless example, but you also see this fallacy crop up in political discussions, for example with healthcare. If we let people have free healthcare,
Next thing you know, they all want free cars and cell phones, and the more free stuff people have, the lazier they'll get, and if everyone is lazy, the whole economy will collapse. That's a slippery slope fallacy and should be challenged in a discussion.
But why is it even important that we have identified this? Why is it not enough to just say, this is a bad argument, and leave it at that? What's the point of including all the terminology? Well, if you were just to call it a bad argument, it would be really hard to argue against it, or even explain why it's a bad argument in the first place. The point of recognizing it as a certain fallacy and attaching it to the terminology of slippery slope makes it much easier to identify and explain why an argument is invalid, and to create an argument against it. In the case of the slippery slope fallacy, countering it is easy. Simply question how each intermediate step convincingly leads to the next step on the journey from the mild event to the proposed extreme result. Recognizing logical fallacies is important, especially now, when there are so many people with the intent to mislead the public with misinformation, with tools like the internet to easily accomplish it. Realizing when an argument is invalid is a great way to make sure you don't become a vector for the spread of fake news, like some misinformation mosquito. Moreover, understanding logical fallacies will also strengthen your ability to argue productively and effectively. There will be more videos on other common logical fallacies to come, and for now, thank you for listening.